Welcome to the TC. My name's David, and today we're going to be taking a look at the iPhone 12. Nearly 5 years after its release, how does it hold up in 2025? So, let's get into the video. The iPhone 12 originally came out in 2020, and now that it's 5 years old, is it still worth it on the used market? Or maybe is it time to upgrade? Let's break it down and see if the iPhone 12 still holds up in 2025. So the iPhone 12 introduced the modern flat edge design that we have with the current iPhone generations. The curves and edges on the iPhone 12 are more sharp than something like we have on the 15 and 16. That doesn't make it bad though. I think that this phone still looks very sharp today. And honestly, if you told me that this was like an iPhone 14, I would probably believe you if it wasn't for the camera bump on the back. One of the other things though I think that kind of makes this phone less appealing is that it does have a glossy rear glass, and of course that does attract a lot of fingerprints. The newer iPhones did switch this to a matte texture, so something to keep in mind. I don't think it's that big of a deal though, considering most people are just going to slap a case on it anyway. I do think that this phone does feel great in the hand. It's very lightweight, easy to hold, and the display is big enough that it doesn't seem like everything's super small, but also small enough that you can reach pretty much around every corner of the device without too much hassle. I do like that it is very lightweight and thin, especially comparing it to the newer iPhones, because yeah, this feels pretty good to have in like your pocket. You don't really feel it at all. Of course, they also did have the 12 mini, and that's a different story, but for now, we're just going to be taking a look at the iPhone 12. Overall though, I think that the design on the iPhone 12 is very good, and it doesn't really feel that outdated at all. So if you're looking at this phone from a design perspective, I think that this is a very relevant phone still today. So what about that display though? This does have a 6.1-inch Super Retina XDR display, as Apple would call it. It's a fancy way of just saying it's an OLED display. What it does have is support for HDR, and if you remember, the previous iPhone 11 was an LCD display, and this one is OLED. So the blacks are actually black, and just colors overall are a lot better in my opinion over something like the 11. This was a pretty huge upgrade at the time for the display of the regular iPhone series, and I think it still holds up well today. Of course, there is still the notch, and this is the full-size notch. It did get decreased with the newer iPhones like the 13, and eventually we did get the dynamic island. However, I don't think that's that big of a deal, and especially for people on a budget, really having a notch isn't going to be a game changer. Where I think this phone does feel kind of dated is the 60Hz display. Of course, the new iPhone 16 does have a 60Hz display, and I think that is definitely an area that Apple really needs to upgrade. Of course, they're doing this in order to have segmentation with their devices. They want you to get a Pro model if you want something like 120Hz. I think that this does hurt the consumer in the long run though. For most people, 60Hz is okay, but I feel like for the money that you're paying for a new iPhone, it really should be 120Hz or at least 90Hz. But considering this device used is significantly less than a new iPhone, I guess it is a little bit excusable that it does have 60Hz. Just something to keep in mind. Other than that though, the display on the iPhone 12 is pretty good. I would say that it does get plenty bright enough, maybe not so bright in, bright daylight situations, but for most cases, I feel like this phone's display is still very good. So what about performance of the iPhone 12? Well, the iPhone 12 does have the A14 Bionic chip. This isn't the fastest chip, especially now. However, I do think that it still holds its own today. Honestly, it's fast enough for what most people will be doing with their phones, such as social media browsing, maybe play a game every now and then, or, edit a photo. And honestly, this phone is perfectly fine for that. Of course, if you get a newer iPhone, it's going to be faster, it might have more RAM and all that, but for the majority of people, I do feel like the iPhone 12 is more than adequate. It might be adequate for you too, but if you are a power user, you are definitely going to want to look for a more powerful, newer iPhone, or maybe go with a Pro model. The reason why I say that is because this iPhone only has 4GB of RAM, which can make things like apps in the background have to reload if you have them sitting in the background and want to open it up again. It might not keep it where it was, so you might have to reload those apps. However, I think that for the majority of people looking at something like an iPhone 12, that doesn't really matter too much. If you do want more RAM, you will have to opt for a Pro model though. One of the biggest things though I do think that having more RAM allows you to do though is also software updates. And yeah, the iPhone 12 is from 2020 now. It's kind of hard to believe that, but considering that Apple usually gives around 6 to 7 years of support for their phones, and yeah, I mean, we're kind of approaching that, so I wouldn't be surprised if this only gets like 1 or 2 more major updates for the iOS. However, I think for the majority of people looking at this phone and how much it costs, that shouldn't be too much of a problem. It doesn't really become a problem until after the phone doesn't have support for like a year or two, because then the apps are required to have a newer iOS version. But as of right now, the iPhone 12 is fully supported. It does support iOS 18, so honestly, as it is, I think that it's fine. Yeah. There is also no AI support on this phone, so Apple Intelligence, it doesn't work on this phone, obviously. However, I don't think that's such a bad thing because Apple Intelligence, as it is right now, isn't really fully fleshed, and I haven't been super impressed with it in my experience, so I don't think that Apple Intelligence is a deal breaker for a lot of people. Even power users like me, like, it's not a really big deal breaker. I just kind of wanted to try it out. But yeah, honestly, you're not missing much without having Apple Intelligence. And pretty much like 80% of the Apple Intelligence stuff you can already do using other apps. If you really wanted to try that, try things like ChatGPT, and you pretty much have a lot of the stuff that the iOS update for Apple Intelligence has. So as for the camera system on the iPhone 12, you do get dual cameras on the back. That's something that the iPhone 16e doesn't have, but we'll gloss over that. You have a 12 megapixel main sensor along with a 12 megapixel ultra wide. And having the ultra wide, I think, is a really awesome thing for this phone. It was introduced with the 11 series, but the 12 made it a little bit better. You do get better dynamic range, I noticed, with the ultra wide on this phone, and of course you do have like the night mode, and I feel like low light is improved from the 11 series. Of course, it's not as good as what you're going to get on the 13, 14, 15, and so on. However, I think for the majority of people, they're going to be using this for like social media, taking photos of their family, pets, whatever. I think that's more than adequate. And 12 megapixels does help keep the size of the photos down, so that is something to keep in mind. However, I do know that the base iPhone 12 starts at 64 gigabytes. If you are looking on the used market for an iPhone 12, I would definitely opt for at least 128 gigabytes. That was the mid-tier option at the time. It might cost a little bit more, but I think it's well worth it in the end. Something to also keep in mind is that I feel like the iPhone 12 series as a whole has less aggressive HDR. With the newer iPhones, it is getting more and more aggressive to the point where you kind of have to edit your photos to be a little bit more contrasty, because the HDR on the new iPhones, like newer generations, is so aggressive that it just lifts your shadows super high and puts your highlights down so much that the photos look a little bit flat. The photos from the iPhone 12 do have a little bit more contrast in comparison to newer iPhones. So what about battery life and charging? Well, the iPhone 12 wasn't exactly a battery life champ when it came out, and today, yeah, you're definitely going to feel that. Most of the iPhone 12s today are probably going to have a pretty degraded battery unless they've been replaced. And of course, you can check the battery health of the iPhone going into settings, but that's not always an option when you're buying used. So if you have the opportunity to, and you can ask the seller, see what the battery health is at. If it's anything below like 85, I would say, then you might want to consider a battery replacement if you're going to buy that phone. But I feel like anything above, 88 and probably around 90 is pretty much good for you. Obviously, if you can get one that has perfect battery health with a new battery, that's even better. One thing I do like about this phone is that this was the first iPhone to introduce MagSafe charging, and it's probably the most convenient way to charge your phone, in my opinion, just because you can just plop it on the charger, starts charging wirelessly, and you're good to go. There is also the lightning port on the bottom, and that is a little bit of an unfortunate thing, but it does make sense. It was an older iPhone, and USB-C didn't get added until the 15 series. So what is nice though is that since USB-C has been around for a while now on the iPhone series, the lightning accessories are getting a little bit cheaper since less people are using them. So yeah, it might be beneficial to you to have the lightning. So now I want to talk about price. The iPhone 12 used is around 250 to 300, maybe 350 for a really good model, like cosmetically, battery health, and everything. However, I feel like the sweet spot for this phone is definitely going to be like 128 gigabytes and around like a 90% battery health if possible. Obviously, that's not always the case, and you're not going to be able to find like perfect examples. You could do something like eBay refurbished and, take a little bit of a gamble. I noticed that the prices for those tend to be a little bit more favorable. Or if you have the ability to, you can also do the eBay auctions with pre-owned devices. Usually sellers will put the battery health in a photo and you get to see the device that you're actually buying. So that's another option as well. However, I do feel like for the price of this phone and the age, maybe I would try to spring for something like an iPhone 13 or even a 14, just so that you get extra software support. And there's some other niceties as well. My go-to right now would probably be something like an iPhone 13 Pro, just because you get so much more for the money. Of course, it might be maybe an extra $100, but I do feel like it is a very worthy $100 extra. So yeah, I mean, that's what I think about the iPhone 12. If you have an iPhone 12 right now, I think that it's still a pretty potent phone, and if you're not really doing super heavy tasks with it, you should be fine for a good while. However, if you are looking to upgrade or you're coming from a different phone and you want to have an iPhone, I feel like the sweet spot right now is probably going to be in the 13 series, just because it's kind of the mid-tier where prices are pretty low, but also it's new enough that you're still getting a lot of the nice features for the price that you're paying. So what do you guys think? Do you own an iPhone 12 or are you considering upgrading? Let me know in the comments down below. And if this video helped you, don't forget to like and subscribe down below to see more videos just like this. I'm always looking for suggestions as well, so if you guys have anything you want to see, let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.